Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I was a technician monitoring a secret Mars mission. What they discovered is being hidden from the world. So, this all started about a year ago, back when I was working as a low-level technician at a pretty boring but well-paying job. I was basically the guy who watched a bunch of monitors all day, checking data and making sure nothing went wrong. Most of the time, it was the most routine stuff imaginable. Server checks, system updates, that kind of thing. I had no idea how my life was about to flip upside down. One afternoon, right around the time I usually start zoning out and thinking about what I'll make for dinner, I got an email. It was from my supervisor, and it was marked urgent. Now, this guy never sends emails, like ever. He's one of those dudes who just walks around the office and taps people on the shoulder. Seeing something from him pop up in my inbox? Weird. The email said I needed to report to conference room C for a special project briefing. Now, if you've ever worked in a place like this, you know what that sounds like. More overtime for no extra pay. So I wasn't exactly thrilled, but I went anyway, figuring I could sneak out early if it was just more busy work. When I got to the room, there were only 4 other people sitting around the table. I recognized 2 of them, other techs like me, but the other 2, they looked way too serious for this office. They were dressed in these sleek black suits, and they both had that military posture, you know, where they stand like they're ready to jump into action at any moment. And the weirdest part? One of them had a NASA patch on his sleeve. Now, at this point, I'm thinking maybe this is some kind of internal cybersecurity thing. Maybe a big project they don't want us talking about. But then the lights dimmed, and one of the suit guys stood up, clearing his throat, like he was about to make a speech. "Everything we discuss here today is classified," he said, his voice cold and emotionless. "By entering this room, you are agreeing to be a part of something bigger than anything you've ever imagined. If you speak a word of this to anyone, we will know." I could feel the tension in the room, like everyone was holding their breath. I tried to stay calm, but my mind was racing. Classified? I fix servers. I'm not cut out for classified. Then they dropped the bombshell. "You're being selected for a mission support team," the guy continued. "A project that's been under wraps for nearly 5 years. This is beyond NASA, beyond SpaceX. This is top-level government work." Okay, now they had my attention. I mean, I'm a huge space nerd, always have been. I grew up on those sci-fi movies where humans colonize other planets, and I figured, yeah, maybe someday. But secret space missions, that's conspiracy theory stuff. Except it wasn't. He pulled up a presentation on the screen behind him. It was just some images at first. Photos of Mars. Nothing too unusual. I mean, I'd seen images like this all the time, right? Red dust, rocks, the usual. But then the photos started getting stranger. There was one that looked like a cave, not too big, but definitely not something you'd expect to find in those smooth Martian plains. Another photo was just black, except for this faint glimmer in the distance, like a light reflecting off metal. It was hard to tell exactly what it was, but my stomach dropped. "This is Mars," he said, stating the obvious. "But this isn't what you've been shown. This is what we've found." He paused, letting that sink in for a second. "We've been running secret missions to Mars since 2018, and what we've discovered there, well, the public can't know. Not yet. That's where you come in. We need a team of trusted technicians to monitor the data feed from our most recent mission. What you see, what you hear, stays in this room. I was too stunned to speak. Everyone was. I mean, how do you even react to something like that? Secret Mars missions. Discoveries we weren't allowed to know about. But the thing is, I wasn't scared. I was intrigued. I guess that's the nerd in me. I wanted to know more. I needed to know more. So I nodded, along with everyone else. The man in the suit smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that says, you have no idea what you're getting yourself into. The rest of the meeting was a blur. They went over protocols, security clearances, stuff like that. I barely remember it because my mind was still stuck on those photos, on that weird cave and the shiny glint of metal in the distance. What had they found? What weren't they telling us? We were given access codes, told to be on call 24/7, and that was it. We were officially part of the team monitoring the data stream from Mars, but something felt off, like they were leaving out the most important parts, the things we weren't supposed to know. I should have listened to my gut. I should have walked away right then, but curiosity got the better of me. It always does. That night, as I was lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Whatever they discovered on Mars, it wasn't natural. That much was clear, and I was about to be right in the middle of it. I didn't know it yet, but I was about to be part of something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. So, it was a few days after that briefing when things really started to get weird. I got my schedule for monitoring the mission data, just your average graveyard shift, because of course, the new guy gets the worst hours. But I didn't care. The idea of sitting there and watching a live feed from Mars was enough to keep me pumped, at least at first. The room they put us in was as bland as it gets. Gray walls, fluorescent lights, a few monitors. I was alone most of the time, except for the occasional supervisor checking in. Honestly, it felt more like I was babysitting a server than anything else. The live feed came in bursts. Packets of data transmitted from the Mars rover, then translated into images and readings that would pop up on my screen. The first few shifts were normal, I guess? I mean, as normal as you can get when you're working on a secret Mars mission. I'd get packets with more pictures of rocks, craters, endless stretches of red dust. Pretty much the stuff you'd expect to see on any Mars mission. And I was beginning to think maybe they'd overhyped the whole thing. But then the transmission started to get a little off. It was around 3 a.m. during my 4th or 5th shift. You know that time of night where everything feels a little off? Like the world's asleep, but you're stuck in this bubble of eerie silence. That's when the first strange packet came in. I remember staring at the screen as the feed loaded, expecting another batch of rocks and sand. But the image that came up wasn't a landscape at all. It was inside the cave. Now, I know you're probably thinking, okay, a cave on Mars, that's pretty wild. But here's the thing, the cave wasn't natural. The walls were too smooth, too polished, like something had carved them out with precision. And at the far end of the cave, there was this structure. I don't even know what to call it. It was tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, with these sharp, angular shapes that looked almost metallic. My heart started pounding as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. This wasn't a rock formation. This wasn't something nature could just whip up. This was built by something. The packet also had some audio data, which was strange because we weren't supposed to be getting audio from the rover. I clicked play, and for the first few seconds, all I heard was static, that crackling, empty sound you'd expect from space. But then there was this faint hum, a low, droning noise that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was rhythmic, almost like a pulse, but not quite. I sat there, staring at the screen, listening to that hum, and I realized my hands were shaking. There was something deeply unsettling about it. It wasn't just the sound. It was the fact that it was coming from Mars, a place that should be completely silent, lifeless. And yet, there was this noise. I reported it to my supervisor, of course. I sent him the file and told him something was wrong with the feed, but he barely glanced at it. "Weird transmission errors happen all the time," he said, brushing it off like it was nothing. "Just log it and move on." That wasn't good enough for me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with this mission, but I did as I was told. I logged the error, finished my shift, and went home. The next night, it got worse. Another packet came in, this time with more images of the cave. The rover had moved deeper inside, and the structure was clearer now. It had markings on it, symbols, almost like hieroglyphs, but none that I'd ever seen before. Jagged lines, circles, spirals. They didn't look random. They looked like a language, something designed to be understood if you could just crack the code. There was more audio too, but this time the hum was louder, more distinct, and layered beneath it, barely audible, was something else. A voice. I nearly jumped out of my chair when I heard it. It was faint, distant, and garbled, like someone whispering through a broken radio. But it was there. I rewound the file, played it again and again, trying to make it out. At first, it was just too distorted, but after the fifth or sixth listen, I could make out a single word. Just one. "Leave." I sat there frozen, my eyes locked on the screen, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? Was someone messing with the feed? But that didn't make sense. This was a direct transmission from Mars. No one could fake that, right? I forwarded the file to my supervisor again, and this time I made it clear that something was seriously wrong. But instead of checking it out, he sent me a message back with one sentence. "You're not being paid to speculate." I was furious. They were ignoring something huge, something dangerous, and they didn't care. But what could I do? I was just a technician, a cog in the machine. I couldn't just walk away from this, so I kept going. I kept monitoring the feed. Over the next few days, the transmissions got more and more unsettling. The rover kept moving deeper into the cave, and the images it sent back were wrong. There were more structures now, arranged in strange patterns, like some kind of alien architecture. And the symbols, those jagged, spiraling symbols, were everywhere. The audio grew louder too. The hum had become a constant background noise. And the voice was clearer now. It was no longer a distant whisper. It was speaking directly into the transmission, louder and more urgent. "Leave. Leave now." I couldn't take it anymore. I went to my supervisor's office in person, demanding answers. I told him I needed to know what was happening, that something was out there, something we weren't prepared for. And that's when he said it. That one sentence that still haunts me. "It's not your job to know." Then he shut the door in my face. I walked out of the office that night with one thought echoing in my mind. What aren't they telling us? The next day, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept a wink after my confrontation with my supervisor. My mind was racing with the images and sounds from the transmission, replaying that voice in my head. Leave. Leave now. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. And for the first time, I started to feel like maybe I was in over my head. When I walked into the monitoring room for my shift that night, I noticed something immediately. The vibe was different. Usually, it was just me and a few others, quietly doing our jobs, barely talking. But tonight, there were more people than usual. A couple of higher-ups I didn't recognize were hovering near the back of the room, talking in hushed voices, and the air felt tense, like they knew something I didn't, like something was about to go wrong. I sat down at my station, logged in, and got ready for another night of watching the rovers feed. But here's where things got weird. The feed was down. The live transmission from Mars wasn't coming through. It was just black. At first, I thought it was just another system glitch. I mean, stuff like that happens all the time in this line of work. But the problem wasn't just on my monitor. Every screen in the room was blank. No data, no images, just an eerie, empty void. One of the supervisors, a guy I'd never seen before, came over to me, looking way too calm for the situation. He leaned over my shoulder and said, "There's been a minor disruption in the feed. Keep monitoring." Minor disruption. Right. I've worked enough tech jobs to know when someone's feeding me a line of BS. But before I could ask any questions, he walked away and started talking to the other higher-ups again. An hour went by. Then two. Still nothing. Everyone else in the room looked just as confused as I was, but no one said anything. It was like we were all waiting for something to happen, but no one wanted to admit it. I stared at my screen, my mind racing. What if the rover had found something else? What if it had gone too far into the cave? What if something had gone wrong? Then, just as I was about to start losing it, the screen flickered. It was brief, just a flash of static, but it was enough to make everyone in the room jump. The feed was coming back. But when the transmission finally returned, it wasn't what we expected. The first image that popped up wasn't from the rover's exterior cameras. It was from inside the rover, like a dashboard cam showing the controls and equipment. That was weird enough, but the real kicker was that the rover wasn't moving. It was just sitting there in the darkness of the cave. And the hum, that strange rhythmic pulse I'd been hearing, it was back, louder than ever. I tried to check the system logs to figure out what had happened, but the data wasn't loading. It was like the whole system had been wiped. Every command the rover had received, every movement it had made, all of it was just gone. I turned to one of the other techs. "Is your data loading?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head, his face pale. Whatever had happened, it had affected the entire system. Suddenly, the feed cut to another image. It was the cave again, but this time, something was different. The metallic structure we'd seen before was closer now, like the rover had moved toward it, but we hadn't issued any commands for that. And around the base of the structure, there were these shadows. At first, I thought maybe it was just the lighting, or maybe some artifact in the transmission. But as I squinted at the screen, I realized those weren't shadows. They were figures. They weren't clear, more like dark, blurry shapes. But they were definitely moving, slowly, almost deliberately. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out what they were. There was something unnatural about the way they moved, jerky, as if they didn't quite belong in the environment. I glanced around the room, hoping someone else had noticed, but everyone was staring at their own screens, expressions frozen. The higher-ups were nowhere to be seen now. It was just us. Suddenly, the feed cut out again, static. I tried rebooting the system, thinking maybe it was just another glitch, but nothing worked. The data stream was completely dead. I was about to call over the supervisor when, out of nowhere, the static on the screen shifted. It wasn't black and white anymore. It was red. It started slow, like the static was bleeding color, but within seconds, the entire screen was flooded with this deep, pulsating red. The hum, which had been soft in the background, grew louder and louder until it was all I could hear. It felt like the walls were vibrating with the sound, like the very air around me was buzzing with it. Then, through the red static, I saw something. A face. I couldn't make out the details, but there was no mistaking the outline of a human face. Eyes. Mouth. It was staring right into the camera, right at me. My heart stopped. I could barely breathe. What was I looking at? It couldn't be the rover. It didn't have a camera that could capture faces like this. This was something else. Something alive. And then the voice came through again, clearer than ever before. Leave. Now. That was it. I shot out of my chair, heart pounding in my throat. I looked around the room, expecting someone, anyone, to react, but no one moved. They just stared blankly at their screens, as if they hadn't seen or heard anything. I grabbed my phone and tried calling my supervisor, but there was no signal. I tried emailing him, but the computer wasn't responding. It was like everything in the room had gone dead. That's when I heard it. A low mechanical whirring sound coming from behind me. Slowly, I turned around, and there, on one of the other monitors, was the rover's dashboard cam again. Except this time, the rover was moving. I hadn't touched the controls. None of us had. But the rover was moving deeper into the cave. I watched, helpless, as the feed showed the metallic structure getting closer and closer. The shadows, those figures, still lurking at the edges of the frame. And then, the whirring stopped. The screen went black. I stood there, frozen, as the humming grew louder in the room, like it was coming from the walls themselves. My ears were ringing. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to do, but I knew one thing for sure. Something had taken control of the rover, and whatever it wasn't human. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that black screen, but it felt like an eternity. My heart was still racing, and the hum, it wasn't just in my ears anymore. It felt like it was crawling under my skin, vibrating through my bones. I glanced around the room again, desperate for some kind of reaction, but everyone else was acting weird. It was like they were in a trance. No one moved, no one spoke, just blank faces staring at their dead monitors. I couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't seeing what I was seeing. I knew I had to get out of there. Something about the room, the hum, the faces on the screens. It was all wrong. But just as I was about to make a break for the door, it opened. 2 men walked in. They weren't the usual supervisors or higher-ups. They were dressed in the same black suits as the guys from the initial briefing, and their expressions were cold, unreadable. They moved with purpose, scanning the room like they were assessing the situation. One of them, a tall guy with slicked back hair, approached my station. "Everything under control?" he asked, his voice flat and emotionless. I could barely manage to nod, my throat dry. He glanced at the black screen in front of me, then back at me. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something, maybe question why the feed was down, but instead, he just smiled. It wasn't a reassuring smile. It was more like he knew something I didn't, and that scared me even more. "You're relieved of your shift," he said. "Go home." Go home? Just like that? I was halfway convinced they were about to haul me into some secret interrogation room, but instead, they were telling me to leave. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to ask questions, to demand answers, but I didn't. I just grabbed my stuff and bolted. The drive home was a blur. My mind kept replaying the last transmission, that face in the red static, the voice telling me to leave. And those shadows, the figures in the cave, what the hell were they? I couldn't stop thinking about how none of this made sense. Why was the rover still moving? Why was no one reacting to any of it? When I finally got home, I locked every door and window, something I hadn't done in years. Paranoia had crept in deep. My apartment felt like the only safe place. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hum. God, that hum. It still lingered in the back of my head, like a mosquito that wouldn't leave me alone. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, that twisted outline in the static. It felt too real, too vivid. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed answers. The next morning, I tried to log into the work system from home, figuring I could at least check the rover's data logs, or maybe see if there were any updates. But my access was denied. My credentials, everything, had been wiped, like I'd never even worked there. I called the office, but my supervisor's line went straight to voicemail. No one else picked up either. Something wasn't right. I knew they were hiding something much bigger than a failed transmission. So, against my better judgment, I decided to dig deeper. I spent the next few hours scouring forums, back channels, anything I could find about secret Mars missions. I wasn't expecting much. Most of the stuff out there is just conspiracy theory nonsense. But then I found something. A post buried in an old abandoned thread on some forgotten corner of the web. The post didn't have much detail, but it mentioned a classified Mars mission that had gone silent back in 2019. The mission wasn't NASA's. It was run by some private entity, backed by the government. The details were vague, but it talked about anomalous structures discovered on the surface, specifically inside a cave system. My heart sank. It was too close to what I'd seen. The cave, the metallic structure, the symbols, everything lined up. The post didn't have much more information, but the final sentence hit me like a punch to the gut. Everyone involved in the mission vanished. No trace. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands trembling. Vanished? No trace? Was that what they were trying to cover up? I couldn't just sit there. I had to talk to someone. There was one guy from work, Dan, another tech who'd been in the same briefing as me. He'd seemed freaked out too, but I hadn't seen him since the blackout. I still had his number, so I called him, hoping he could fill in the blanks. When he answered, his voice was shaky, like he hadn't slept in days. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he said, before I could even get a word out. "What are you talking about?" I asked, even though I knew exactly what he meant. "The face," he whispered. "In the static, I saw it too." My stomach flipped. I hadn't told anyone about the face, not even my supervisor. "Dan, what the hell is going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer for a long time. I could hear him breathing, could feel his hesitation through the phone. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not just a glitch. They found something. something that shouldn't be there. I pressed him for more details, but he was too scared to say much. He just kept repeating that phrase, something that shouldn't be there. Eventually, he hung up, telling me to be careful and not to dig any further. But it was too late for that. I couldn't stop now. I had to know. That night, I went back into the office. I knew it was a risk, but I had to see the data for myself. I still had a key card, and after hours, the place was usually dead. I managed to sneak in without any problems and headed straight for the monitoring room. The screens were all off, and the place was eerily quiet, but I knew where the server room was. If the data was still anywhere, it would be there. When I got to the server room, I swiped my card and slipped inside. The air was cold, and the hum of the machines filled the room. But something was wrong. The servers, most of them were gone. Rows of empty racks stared back at me. The machines that had held the mission data, the transmission logs, everything, they were gone. All that was left were a few stray wires dangling like veins ripped out of a corpse. Panic set in. I rushed back to the monitoring room, hoping to at least check the system logs, but the screens were still dark. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. One of the monitors flickered to life, the static bleeding across the screen in slow, pulsing waves. And through the static, I saw it again. That face. But this time, it wasn't just an outline. The features were clearer, more defined. The eyes, if you could call them that, were empty, black pits. The mouth twisted into a grimace, as if it was screaming in silence. And it was closer now. Too close. The voice came through again, louder than ever. Leave. Now. I stumbled backward, my breath caught in my throat. I turned to run, but before I could reach the door, the hum, the same hum that had been haunting me for days, grew louder, filling the room with a low, pulsating dread. And then, all at once, it stopped. The room was dead silent. The monitor went black, and I was left standing there, alone, in the dark. I don't remember how I got home that night. The drive was a blur, my mind completely shot. I couldn't stop thinking about that face, the way it had stared at me through the static like it knew I was watching, like it wanted me to see it. The voice, too. Its command was clear, but it didn't feel like a warning anymore. It felt like a threat. By the time I made it back to my apartment, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me, every instinct telling me to stay inside, to never go back. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't just forget about it. I had to figure out what they'd found on Mars, why everything was disappearing. People, data, even the servers themselves. This wasn't just some random glitch or technical error. This was bigger. I spent the next few days doing nothing but research. I couldn't go back to work. They'd probably locked me out anyway. But I had enough saved files on my personal drive to start piecing things together. Every night, I stayed up late, combing through every scrap of information I could find, every obscure article and forgotten forum thread. The more I looked, the more I found references to the same thing. Secret Mars missions, anomalies in cave systems, and then silence. There were whispers about classified projects, undisclosed incidents involving private contractors, but the real smoking gun came when I stumbled across a name, Ari's Protocol. I couldn't find much about it. Most of the information was either scrubbed or locked behind government firewalls, but I managed to dig up a single document hidden in the metadata of an old science blog. It was incomplete, but what was there was enough to make my blood run cold. The Ari's Protocol was initiated after the discovery of non-terrestrial structures on Mars. The document mentioned artificial formations that had been detected in 2018, just like the ones I'd seen in the rover's feed. But then it got worse. The protocol involved containment measures for any biological anomalies found within the structures. Whatever had been discovered on Mars, it wasn't just a bunch of weird rocks or metallic ruins. They had found something alive. I was reading that last sentence when my computer screen flickered. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. After all, my system had been on for days, and I was running way too many tabs at once. But then, the flickering stopped, and the screen went black. Before I could react, the hum returned. It wasn't just coming from the computer. It was in the room, surrounding me, filling my head with that low, rhythmic pulse. I stood up, heart pounding, and watched as my computer flickered back to life. But instead of my browser or research files, it was the same static I'd seen in the monitoring room. That deep red glow bled through the pixels, like my entire screen was drowning in crimson light. And then, through the static, came the face. It was clearer now, more real, almost tangible. The features were distorted, stretched in ways that didn't make sense, but those eyes, those black, hollow eyes, locked onto mine. The voice followed, low and guttural, like it was coming from the depths of the earth itself. Leave. Now. My legs buckled. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. The hum was vibrating through my entire body now, louder than ever. I tried to move, to shut the computer off, but I couldn't. I was frozen, trapped in that gaze. The face twisted into a grotesque grin, its mouth opening wider and wider until it was nothing but a dark, gaping void. The voice came again, louder this time, almost a roar. Leave. Now. And then it cut out. Just like that. The hum stopped. The screen went dark, and the room was completely silent. I was left standing there, my heart pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. For a long time, I didn't move. I couldn't. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But deep down, I knew there was no sense to be made. Whatever was happening, whatever they'd found on Mars, it was beyond anything we could understand. I spent the next few hours packing. I didn't even care where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay here. Every shadow in my apartment felt like it was watching me. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. I had to get away, as far as possible. I was almost out the door when my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. For a second, I considered ignoring it, but something told me to answer. I pressed the phone to my ear, half expecting to hear that same distorted voice from the transmissions. But it wasn't. It was Dan. His voice was shaky, like he was barely holding it together. "They're watching us," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "I've been trying to get through to you. You have to stop. Stop looking into it. They know, man. They know." "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "The people running this thing. The ones in charge of the arteries protocol. They're cleaning up, deleting everything. Everyone." I could hear the panic in his voice, and I realized then that he was running. I could hear the sound of footsteps, heavy breathing, like he was trying to get away from something. "Dan, what the hell is happening?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. But he didn't answer. All I heard was a sharp intake of breath, then a click. The line went dead. I stood there, the phone still pressed to my ear, the silence stretching out around me. Whatever was going on, it was bigger than just a secret Mars mission, bigger than just some strange structures in a cave. This was something else, something they were willing to erase everyone involved to keep hidden. That was the last time I heard from Dan. I left town that night. I drove for hours, not caring where I ended up. I just needed to put distance between me and whatever had been set in motion. I thought I could escape it, thought that maybe if I left it all behind, I'd be safe. But I was wrong, because last night, as I was lying in bed in some random motel trying to sleep, I heard it again, the hum. It's here, with me. Wherever I go, it follows. And now I know it's never going to stop. Not until I'm gone, too. I don't know how long I have, but I'm writing this down as a warning. To anyone reading this, if you ever hear about the Ares protocol, if you ever see those strange structures on Mars, if you ever hear that voice in the static, leave. Now, before it's too late. I worked in a government lab analyzing alien artifacts. The objects are starting to communicate with us. So, first off, I never expected to be the kind of guy who ends up writing this stuff online. I'm a pretty down-to-earth person, all things considered. I grew up watching conspiracy theory videos for fun, you know, like Bigfoot, UFOs, all that stuff, but I never believed any of it. I just thought it was entertaining. Well, up until a few months ago, I would have laughed at the idea that any of that could be real. But now, man, I don't know what to believe anymore. Let me back up a little bit. My name's Eric. I used to work for this top secret government research lab. Yeah, I know how it sounds, but it's true. I can't give out too many details about where it was or what the lab was actually called. They'd come after me if I did. But let's just say it was one of those facilities buried deep in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those places where they do sensitive work. I had a background in archaeology, nothing too crazy, but somehow I got scooped up by the government. They wanted someone who could study artifacts that had been found in different parts of the world. And by artifacts, I'm not talking about ancient pots or ceremonial daggers. No, these things, they didn't look like anything human-made. I mean, they didn't even look like they were from Earth. There were about 15 of us, all specialized in different areas. The thing that made this whole job weird from the start was how little information they gave us. Normally, you'd expect some big debriefing, right? You think they'd tell us where these things came from, who found them, or why they were important. Nope. They just handed us the objects and said, figure out what this is. And these things, they were strange. Like, the first object I worked on looked like a black stone, almost like obsidian, but it had this unnatural shine to it. And it was cold. Not like left in the freezer for a while, cold, but unnaturally cold, as if it was rejecting the heat from your skin. We weren't allowed to touch them directly. Everything had to be done in a controlled environment, with gloves and special equipment. The lab had this air of paranoia, like the higher-ups were afraid we'd contaminate the objects, or maybe the other way around. We had no idea what they did. At first glance, they looked like random, meaningless objects, rocks, metal plates, weird geometric shapes. But as we dug deeper, ran tests, did scans, things started to get off. You ever hear about those stories where someone looks at an ancient artifact for too long and they start feeling weird, like they're being watched or something? Well, that's the best way I can describe it. It was subtle at first. I'd be sitting there, staring at one of the objects on the examination table, and I'd feel this creeping sensation on the back of my neck. like someone was standing behind me. I'd turn around, expecting to see one of my coworkers, but there'd be no one. Every time. I thought maybe I was just stressed. It was a high-pressure environment after all, right? But then, other people in the lab started saying the same thing. Some of them even refused to work with certain objects anymore. One guy, Jake, who worked in the next room, had a full-blown meltdown one afternoon. We found him in the corner, shaking, staring at this metal cube with these engraved symbols on it that nobody could read. When we asked him what happened, he just kept mumbling something about how the cube was talking to him. Naturally, everyone freaked out. The bosses pulled Jake aside for a private meeting, and the next day, he was gone. Just like that. We never saw him again. No explanation, no goodbye email, nothing. Now, you'd think this would be a major red flag for me, but I wasn't exactly in a position to walk away. Plus, I was curious. The more time I spent around these objects, the more I needed to know what they were. It felt like they were pulling me in, making me obsessed. And to be honest, it didn't help that there were no real answers. I'm the type of person who can't stand not knowing something, and this job was nothing but mysteries. The next couple of weeks were pretty uneventful, at least compared to Jake's little breakdown. We kept our heads down, did our work, and avoided talking about what happened to him. But there was this underlying tension. Everyone was on edge, and then things started to escalate. The first major incident happened during a routine test. We had one of the smaller artifacts. It looked kind of like a metallic sphere, smooth with no markings or seams, and we were running some basic thermal tests on it. Nothing crazy, just applying different levels of heat to see how it reacted. Except this time, it reacted in a way that it shouldn't have. The sphere started vibrating. At first, it was subtle, almost like a phone on silent mode, but then it got more intense. The vibrations became so strong that the entire table was shaking. Alarms started going off, and we rushed to shut down the equipment. But before we could, the sphere changed. It didn't melt, it didn't crack, it just shifted. 1 second, it was a solid sphere. The next, it had opened up like a flower, revealing these intricate, alien-looking mechanisms inside. And that's when the lights went out. Total blackout. Now, I don't scare easily, but in that moment, standing in complete darkness, with only the sound of that thing humming in front of us, I felt a chill run down my spine. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the sphere closed back up, the vibration stopped, and the power came back on. Everyone just stood there, staring at it. No one said a word. But from that point on, we all knew it wasn't just random objects we were dealing with. These things, they were alive in some way. Or worse, they were aware of us. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing that sphere vibrating, the way it opened up, like it was watching us. I started wondering if that's what happened to Jake. Maybe whatever was inside those objects had gotten into his head, started whispering things. Because lately, I've been hearing something too. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. You know how, when you're alone in a quiet room, and you think you hear a faint noise, like distant whispers. That's what it sounded like. But the longer I stayed in that lab, the louder it got. It was subtle, but it was there, like a voice just out of earshot, and I wasn't the only one who noticed it. I don't know what's going on, but whatever these artifacts are, they aren't just relics from some ancient civilization. There's something else entirely, and I'm starting to think we never should have messed with them in the first place. The day after the blackout, things felt off. I mean, they had already been weird, but now it was like the entire lab had shifted. People were quieter, more reserved. It was as if we'd all silently agreed that what happened with the sphere wasn't something we were going to talk about. We didn't want to talk about it. The thing is, in a place like that, you get used to strange things happening. We were all trained to compartmentalize, to stay focused on the task. But it was like that event with the sphere had triggered something. After the blackout, everyone seemed more paranoid, more afraid. I know I was. And it wasn't just about the sphere anymore. It was everything. You ever get that feeling like something is wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it? That was how it felt every time I walked into the lab now. The air was thicker, like it was harder to breathe. The lights seemed a little dimmer, even though we all knew they weren't. Every shadow seemed a little too dark. But the worst part, that voice I'd been hearing, the faint whispers at the edge of my consciousness, started getting louder. I thought I was losing my mind. I'd be sitting in my room late at night, trying to unwind, trying to not think about the lab, and suddenly I'd hear it. It wasn't words, not exactly. More like a low hum, a sound that didn't quite make sense, but I knew it was coming from them. The artifacts. I tried to convince myself it was just the stress. I'd been working too many hours, not sleeping enough, and the pressure of the job was finally catching up to me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. It couldn't be. It was too consistent, too real. It felt like someone, or something, was trying to get inside my head. One night, I stayed late in the lab. I had this nagging feeling that I couldn't shake, like I was missing something important. Everyone else had gone home, and it was just me, the artifacts, and the steady hum of the ventilation system. The lab was eerily quiet. It always was at night, but this time it felt more empty than usual. I walked over to the room where they kept the more active artifacts, the ones we'd been warned about, the ones that had caused disturbances. The sphere was there, sitting in its containment unit. It looked harmless now, just a smooth metal ball, but I knew better. I stood there, staring at it, waiting for something to happen, and then I heard it. Not the hum this time, actual words. At first, I thought maybe someone had come back into the lab, but when I looked around, there was no one. It was just me. My heart was racing, but I couldn't move. I felt frozen in place. And the voice, it wasn't coming from outside. It was in my head. It was speaking in a language I didn't understand. The words were garbled, distorted, like they were being filtered through static. But they were there, clear as day, echoing in my skull. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I couldn't do either. I just stood there, listening to this thing inside my head, trying to make sense of it. It was like it was trying to tell me something, but I didn't know what. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the voice. It was suffocating. I bolted out of the lab and went straight home, my mind racing. The whole drive back, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something sitting in the back seat, watching me. When I finally got home, I locked the doors, closed all the blinds, and just sat there, in the dark, trying to calm myself down. The voice didn't come back that night, but I knew it wasn't over. Whatever these artifacts were, they weren't just pieces of alien technology. They were alive in some way, and they were starting to reach out to us, to me. The next day, I tried to talk to one of my coworkers about it, Sarah. She had been working with me on the Sphere project and had noticed some of the strange things too. We grabbed coffee during lunch, and I casually brought up the blackout incident, testing the waters. "You felt it too, right?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant. She looked up at me, her eyes dark with exhaustion. She hadn't been sleeping either. "Felt what?" I leaned in a little, lowering my voice. "The sphere, the vibration, the blackout, the way it opened." She stared at me for a long moment, and for a second I thought she was going to brush me off, tell me it was nothing. But then she whispered, "I hear them too." That was all she said, but it was enough. We didn't talk about it again, but from that moment on, we both knew we were in something much deeper than we'd signed up for. We were hearing the same things, experiencing the same strange phenomena, and I wasn't the only one having nightmares. It wasn't long before more people in the lab started to crack, quietly at first, but you could see it in their eyes, the way they avoided certain objects, how they whispered in the break room. A few people quit without notice, and they were never replaced. It was like the higher-ups didn't care anymore. Maybe they knew something we didn't. Then, one night, Sarah didn't show up for work. I tried calling her, texting her, but there was no response. The next morning, her apartment was empty. No one seemed to know where she went. Her phone was disconnected, just gone, like Jake, like they'd never existed. By now, I was running on paranoia and caffeine. I didn't trust anyone, and I sure as hell didn't trust the lab, but I couldn't leave. I didn't know why, but I needed to stay. Maybe it was the objects themselves, pulling me in. Maybe it was the unanswered questions that gnawed at my brain every second of every day. Or maybe it was something more sinister. One night, after another long, exhausting day at the lab, I fell asleep on my couch, too tired to make it to bed. When I woke up in the middle of the night, groggy and disoriented, I realized the hum wasn't in my head anymore. It was in my apartment. I sat up, my heart pounding, and there it was again. The same voice, speaking in that alien language, but now it was louder, clearer. It wasn't inside my mind anymore. It was around me. I could feel it, vibrating in the air, like the walls themselves were whispering to me. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to that voice speak words I couldn't understand. But when it finally stopped, I knew, deep down, that the artifacts weren't just communicating with us. They were watching us, and I had a feeling that soon they'd want more than just a conversation. After that night in my apartment, the line between the lab and the outside world started to blur. The voice, the thing that was communicating through those artifacts, it wasn't just confined to the lab anymore. It was everywhere. Or at least, it felt that way. Every time I stepped outside, I got the eerie sensation that I was being watched. Not like someone's looking at me from across the street kind of watched, but something bigger. Like the whole world was keeping an eye on me, waiting for me to slip up. And things at the lab, they were spiraling out of control. More people were disappearing. It started with Sarah, but within a week, 3 others were gone too. No emails, no texts, no goodbyes. They just didn't show up one day, and no one seemed interested in finding out why. The higher-ups were acting like nothing was happening, which only made everything worse. It was like they knew, like they were just waiting for us to either quit or vanish one by one. I don't know what kept me there. Curiosity? Stubbornness? Maybe it was the pull of those objects. Whatever it was, I couldn't leave. Not yet. Around that time, we got a new shipment of artifacts. It was always a big deal when they brought in something new. These things weren't found often, and they were always carefully transported in unmarked crates under the highest security. No one knew exactly where they came from. Sometimes it was the desert, sometimes the deep sea, sometimes places they refused to tell us about. This time, they brought in something different. I was there when they unloaded it. It was massive, way bigger than anything we'd seen before. The crate was about the size of a car, and it took 4 of us just to get it into the testing room. When we opened it, everyone fell silent. Inside was what looked like a monolith, a solid black slab about 6 feet tall and 2 feet wide. At first glance, it seemed like another piece of alien rock, but the second we got it into the room, the temperature dropped. Not by a lot, but enough that we all noticed it. It felt like standing in front of an open freezer door. We had no idea what it was, and that made it worse. I kept my distance, watching as the others prepped it for examination. My mind was racing, that familiar hum starting to creep into my thoughts again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the monolith. It was coming from inside me. The voice, it was louder now, closer. I could almost make out words, like they were just on the edge of my understanding, but still slipping through my grasp. The lab had rules about how long we were allowed to work with any given artifact. Max exposure time, they called it. We'd been careful about following that rule after what happened with Jake and Sarah. But when it came to this monolith, everyone started pushing their limits. We couldn't help it. There was something about it, something compelling. I wasn't the only one feeling it either. People started working longer shifts, spending more time in the room with that thing, almost like they were drawn to it. Then the dream started. At first, they were just flashes, darkness, a sensation of floating. But every time I closed my eyes, the dreams got worse. I would see the monolith standing in the middle of a vast, barren landscape, like a desert. But the sky was wrong. It was black, with swirling clouds of deep red and purple. And there was something in the distance. I could never make it out, but I knew it was watching me, studying me. One night, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, and I swore I could still feel the cold from the monolith, even though I was miles away from the lab. That's when I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. The next day, I went into the lab, and everything felt off. There was a tension in the air, like everyone was on edge, but pretending not to be. I noticed fewer people around. No one was saying anything, but I knew. More of them had disappeared. And the worst part, no one was looking for them. Not their families, not the lab. No one. It was like they'd never existed. The government had ways of making people vanish without a trace. But this was different. It wasn't just that they were gone. It was like the artifacts had taken them. I tried to avoid the monolith after that. Every time I walked by the room, I could feel it, like it was calling out to me. That hum would start again, vibrating deep in my skull, but I forced myself to stay away. I didn't want to end up like the others, but then something happened that I couldn't ignore. One night, I was working late again. I wasn't supposed to be, but like I said, the line between work and home had started to disappear. I was doing some data entry when I heard something down the hall, a low, rhythmic thudding sound, like someone was hitting the floor with their fist. I froze, listening. It was late, and there shouldn't have been anyone else around. I stood up and walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the cold, sterile walls. The sound was coming from the room with the monolith. My heart raced as I approached the door, the thudding getting louder with each step. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to leave the lab and never come back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, except for the soft blue glow of the containment lights around the monolith. But what I saw in that light, I'll never forget. There was someone in there, a man, one of my co-workers, though I couldn't tell who at first. He was standing in front of the monolith, his back to me, his arms hanging limp at his sides. But it wasn't just the fact that he was there. It was the way he was moving. His head was tilted back, and his body was swaying side to side, almost like he was in a trance. And that sound, the thudding, it was him, hitting his forehead against the monolith, over and over. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come out. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching as he kept hitting his head against the stone. And then, slowly, his movement stopped. He turned around, and that's when I saw his face. His eyes were empty, not in the figurative sense, literally empty. His pupils were gone, replaced by a pale, milky white. His expression was blank, his mouth slightly open, like he was in some kind of daze. And then, without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, right past me, not even acknowledging I was there. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the monolith. My brain was trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, but nothing made sense anymore. The artifacts, they were doing something to us, changing us, and I was next. After that night, I couldn't shake the image of my co-worker's blank, dead eyes. They haunted me, like a constant presence in the back of my mind, replaying over and over again. The rhythmic thudding, the way his body moved without purpose, like he wasn't even in control anymore. It was like something had taken him, something that was slowly taking all of us. I should have left right then, packed up my things, driven out of town, and never looked back. But I couldn't. By that point, I was too far gone. I wasn't just working at the lab anymore. It was part of me, like the job had wormed its way into my bones. I needed to know what was going on, even though every instinct told me that the answers were going to destroy me. The day after I saw my coworker, things hit a whole new level of strange. I showed up at the lab early, hoping to get in and out before anyone else arrived. The fewer people around, the better. But when I got there, the place was already buzzing, not with people, but with noise. It was coming from the room with the monolith. A low, constant hum filled the hallway, like an electrical current, but deeper, more organic, if that makes any sense. It vibrated through the walls, through the floor, through me. I wasn't supposed to be in the room anymore, not after what happened with my coworker, but I couldn't help it. I had to see what was happening. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was that the containment lights, the ones around the monolith, had turned from blue to red. That wasn't supposed to happen. We had protocols, rules to keep everything contained, but it was like the monolith had overridden them. The hum got louder as I stepped inside, vibrating deep in my chest, making it hard to breathe. And then I saw it. The monolith wasn't just a slab of rock anymore. It was pulsing, slowly, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. The surface of the thing shimmered, almost like liquid, and strange symbols had started to form along its edges. Symbols that hadn't been there before. Symbols that seemed to shift and change as I stared at them, like they were alive. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at it, mesmerized by the way the monolith seemed to be breathing. But then I heard a voice, not in my head this time, out loud, behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun around, heart racing, and saw Dr. Patel standing in the doorway. She was one of the lead researchers, usually calm and collected, but today she looked terrified. Her face was pale and her hands were trembling as she motioned for me to step away from the monolith. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now." "What's going on?" I asked, my eyes darting back to the monolith, which seemed to pulse more intensely as she spoke. "What is this thing?" She hesitated, glancing at the monolith like it was listening, and maybe it was. "We were never supposed to interact with these artifacts the way we have," she said, her voice low and shaky. "We were told to study them, to learn from them, but something changed. I don't know if it's because we've had them too long, or if they're waking up, but whatever these things are, they're not from here. They're not just objects. They're alive." I felt my stomach drop. I'd suspected it for a while, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. I opened my mouth to ask another question, but she cut me off. "They're communicating with each other," she said, her eyes darting toward the glowing red monolith. "And now they're communicating with us." I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My brain was stuck, replaying her words over and over. "They're communicating with us." I didn't understand. How? Why? And what did they want? Before I could ask, the hum from the monolith intensified. The lights in the room flickered, and the air got colder, sharp, like breathing in ice. Dr. Patel took a step back, her face pale. "We have to go," she repeated, more urgently this time. "They're not going to let us leave if we wait too long." I didn't need to be told again. I followed her out of the room, the red glow of the monolith burning into my back as we rushed down the hallway. But even as we ran, the hum followed us, like the whole building was resonating with it, vibrating with some kind of energy that made my teeth ache. When we reached the exit, Dr. Patel slammed her badge against the security panel, her hand shaking so badly that she almost dropped it. The door slid open, and we burst into the freezing night air. It was only when we were standing outside, gasping for breath, that she finally told me the truth. "They've been watching us since day one," she said, leaning against the wall, her face ashen. "Every artifact, every test. It was never about us discovering anything. It was about them learning about us." I didn't want to believe her. I couldn't. But the signs were all there. The disappearances, the strange behavior, the nightmares, the voices in our heads. It all made sense now. The artifacts weren't passive relics. They were probes, and we'd been foolish enough to think we were in control. As we stood there, shivering in the cold, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a message from one of the lab techs or an alert from the security system. But when I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. It was a text from Sarah. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my ears. She was supposed to be gone, disappeared, erased. But there it was, her name flashing on my screen. The message was simple, just 2 words. "Help me." I showed the text to Dr. Patel, and she went even paler. "That's not her," she whispered. "That's them." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely a croak. "The artifacts," she said, her eyes wide. "They're using us, taking our memories, our voices. She's gone, Eric. They've already taken her. And if we don't stop them, we'll be next." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my phone as far as I could, but I couldn't move. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. Help me. 2 simple words that felt like a trap, a lure. But then the phone buzzed again. Another message. I'm so cold. I don't know what came over me, but I bolted back toward the lab. Dr. Patel yelled for me to stop, but I couldn't. If there was even the slightest chance that Sarah was still alive, still in there, I had to try. My mind raced with fear and adrenaline as I sprinted down the darkened hallway, the sound of that infernal hum growing louder with every step. I reached the door to the monolith room and stopped dead in my tracks. The door was open. Inside, the room was bathed in a deep, pulsating red light. The hum was deafening now, a constant, all-encompassing vibration that rattled my bones. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Sarah, or at least something that looked like Sarah. Her back was to me, her body completely still, like she was frozen in place. But the air around her was wrong, warped almost, like the space itself was bending. I called out to her, but my voice felt small, swallowed up by the sound of the monolith. Slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were white, empty. She smiled. When Sarah turned to face me, the smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. The eyes weren't her anymore. They were empty, hollow, like staring into a void where a person used to be. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was how she stood there, unmoving, like a puppet waiting for its strings to be pulled. "Sarah," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum that filled the room. She didn't respond at first, just kept smiling, like she didn't recognize me, or maybe didn't care that I was even there. And then, slowly, in a voice that sounded far away, like it was being transmitted from somewhere deep inside her, she said, "It's so much better here, Eric." I froze. There was something wrong with her voice. It wasn't just the tone, it was the way the words seemed to echo, like they were being spoken by someone or something else using her body. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. She tilted her head, the smile fading slightly. "You don't have to be afraid. They're showing me things, beautiful things." The hum grew louder, vibrating in my skull, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. The air around me felt thick, oppressive, like it was alive. My instinct screamed at me to turn and run, to get as far away from the monolith and whatever Sarah had become as possible. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, drawn in by the red glow pulsing from the monolith, by the strange mechanical beauty of its shifting symbols. I forced myself to speak. "Sarah, what happened to you?" Her smile widened again, but this time it was wrong. Too wide, too forced. "I saw it," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I saw the truth. We've been looking at them all wrong. They're not just objects. They're windows." "Windows?" My voice cracked, my throat dry. She nodded slowly, her movements unnatural, like she wasn't fully in control of her body anymore. "They're showing us what's out there, what's beyond. They want us to understand. But first, we have to let them in." A cold wave of dread washed over me. This wasn't Sarah. Not anymore. This was something else. Something that had taken her and twisted her into this thing. My mind flashed back to the others. The disappearances, the breakdowns, the blank stares of my co-workers. Before they vanished, they hadn't left. They'd been consumed. "They're using you," I said, my voice shaking. They're becoming us," Sarah interrupted, her voice shifting, growing deeper more alien. Her eyes flickered with something dark, something that wasn't human. We are the bridge, the connection. And that's when I noticed it. The room wasn't just filled with the hum anymore. There were voices, whispers overlapping, voices too faint to understand, but too loud to ignore. They filled the space, coming from every direction, from inside my own head, from the monolith, from Sarah, and they were getting louder. I staggered back, my vision blurring as the red glow of the monolith pulsed, faster and faster, in time with the pounding in my head. The whispers, no, the words, were becoming clearer now, like a chant in a language I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. It was as if the artifacts were speaking directly to me, pulling at the edges of my mind. You've seen it too, haven't you? Sarah, or whatever was left of her, took a step toward me. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being dragged forward by invisible strings. They've been calling you. They know you can hear them. I stumbled back, my back hitting the wall. The entire room seemed to pulse with the hum, with the whispers, with the presence of something much larger than anything I could comprehend. I felt it, pressing down on me, filling the space, closing in. They want you to join us, she continued, her voice cracking, splitting into two tones, one that was hers and one that was not. You can't fight it. None of us can. No, I gasped, shaking my head, trying to block out the noise, the voices that were growing louder and more insistent. I won't let them. They're already inside you, Eric, she said softly, taking another step forward. They've been inside you since the day you touched the artifacts. My breath caught in my throat. I remembered the first time I'd touched one of the objects, how cold it had felt, how strange, how, afterward, I'd felt different. The whispers had started not long after that. The dreams, the feeling of being watched. They're us now, she said, her eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. And soon, you'll be them, too. The hum reached a fever pitch, rattling the walls, shaking the floor beneath my feet. I could feel it crawling inside my skin, inside my mind. I clutched my head, trying to block out the whispers, the chanting. But it was too late. They were inside. They had always been inside. I felt my legs buckle, and I collapsed to the floor, the room spinning around me. The monolith pulsed one last time, a blinding red light that filled my vision, burning itself into my retinas. I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything but the deafening roar of the monolith, the alien chant, and Sarah's voice echoing in the darkness. It's over, she whispered. You're one of us now. I felt the cold seep into my bones, a deep, numbing cold that spread through my body, paralyzing me. My thoughts slowed, my mind clouded, and the last thing I saw before everything went dark was the monolith, glowing, shifting, alive. And then, nothing. I woke up in my apartment. At first, I thought it had all been a nightmare. The lab, the monolith, Sarah's twisted smile. But as I sat up, my head pounding, I realized something was wrong. My phone was on the table next to me. The screen lit up with a notification. A message from Sarah. Come back. I stared at the screen, my hands shaking. The world around me felt wrong. Everything was too quiet, too still. The whispers were gone, but I could still feel them, like an echo in the back of my mind, waiting. I got up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtains. Outside, everything looked normal. The street, the cars, the people going about their lives. But as I stared out at the world, I felt it, the cold presence of the monolith, deep inside me. It wasn't over. It had never been over. They were still watching, and now I was one of them. I was recruited to test advanced aerospace technology. The designs came from alien sources. So, this all started a few months ago, and at first, it didn't seem like a big deal. I've always been into tech, especially aerospace stuff. Nothing professional, just a hobby. I'm one of those people who lurk on deep tech forums, looking for the latest breakthroughs, or just cool engineering projects people are working on. So, when I got an email from some private research firm, I figured it was spam or some elaborate phishing scheme. But the weird part, they had my real name, not my screen name. I've never shared my personal info on those forums, so right off the bat, that was a red flag. The email was short and cryptic, something like, "We've been following your contributions and believe your insights would be valuable for a classified aerospace project. If you're interested in testing advanced technology, reply with your availability for a private consultation." Yeah, I know. Classic scam vibes. But the thing is, I had recently posted a detailed analysis of a theoretical propulsion system that some big companies were supposedly working on. It wasn't even anything groundbreaking, just a fun thought experiment. So, how did they connect that to me? My curiosity got the better of me. I replied, half expecting either nothing or some sort of Nigerian prince nonsense. Instead, within hours, I got a response. They wanted to meet me in person. They gave me a location, an airstrip in the middle of nowhere. I googled it, and it was real, but super obscure. Barely any info. They also said they'd cover my travel expenses and provide accommodations. At this point, I was getting more than a little suspicious. But, and I know this sounds dumb, the whole thing just felt legit. Like, whoever was behind this wasn't messing around. So I figured, why not? Worst case, I waste a weekend. The next day, a black SUV pulls up in front of my house. No lie, it looked straight out of a spy movie. Blacked out windows, no logos, nothing. Two guys stepped out, dressed like government agents, but not flashy. They didn't say much, just confirmed my name and told me to hop in. I didn't even tell my friends about this. They'd think I was insane, getting into some random car with strangers to go to God knows where. But for some reason, it felt safe? I can't explain it. Maybe I was too intrigued to feel scared. The drive was long and quiet. We passed the city limits, and then just miles of nothing. Fields, empty roads, the occasional farm. I tried asking the driver where we were going, but all I got was, "You'll see." About 3 hours in, we pulled up to a gated facility, tucked away in the woods. There were no signs, no guards that I could see, but the gate opened automatically like they knew we were coming. I'll admit, by this point, I was feeling a mix of excitement and low-key panic. What the hell was I getting myself into? The SUV parked in front of a large, nondescript building. It looked more like a warehouse than anything high-tech, but appearances can be deceiving, right? The guys who drove me in still hadn't said much, and honestly, I wasn't even sure what to ask. My mind was racing with possibilities. They led me inside, and that's when things started to feel really off. The interior wasn't what I expected at all. No sleek metal walls or high-tech equipment. It was almost boring, plain, just a few offices and a long hallway. But at the end of that hallway was a heavy steel door, and one of the guys swiped a card to unlock it. We walked through, and suddenly, I wasn't in a warehouse anymore. It was like stepping into a whole different world. The room we entered was massive, filled with all sorts of equipment I couldn't begin to identify. In the center of the room, under this blinding overhead light, was what looked like an aircraft, or at least something trying to be an aircraft, but it was nothing like I'd ever seen before. It was sleek, almost organic in design, like someone had sculpted it out of a single piece of metal. There were no visible seams, no bolts, no windows, just this smooth, alien-looking surface. And it wasn't just sitting there. It was hovering. I must have stared at it for a full minute before someone broke the silence. "You like it?" I turned around to see an older man in a lab coat, looking way too casual for what he was standing next to. He introduced himself as Dr. Harrison, the lead researcher on the project. He didn't waste any time either. He jumped straight into the technical details, explaining that what I was looking at wasn't just advanced aerospace tech. It was beyond advanced, like way beyond what we should be capable of. And here's the kicker. They hadn't designed it. They had found it. Now, if this guy had said that in a Reddit thread, I would have laughed and called BS. But standing there, looking at this thing, this hovering, alien-looking craft, it felt different. He said they'd reverse-engineered parts of it, figuring out enough to make it hover, but they had no clue how it actually worked. They'd brought in experts from every field, physics, engineering, even people like me who were just amateurs with a knack for creative problem solving. That's where I came in. They wanted fresh eyes on the project, someone outside the system who wasn't bound by traditional thinking. And here's the part that really freaked me out. Dr. Harrison told me that based on my forum posts, I'd already touched on a few key concepts that matched what they were seeing in this tech. I was unknowingly on the right track. My mind was racing at this point. I wanted to ask a million questions, but before I could get a word out, Dr. Harrison smiled, almost like he was reading my thoughts. "We'll explain everything," he said, "but first, we need you to sign an NDA." So, signing the NDA wasn't as simple as just scribbling my name on a piece of paper. They had me in this small, sterile conference room with two guys who looked like they belonged in a CIA thriller. One of them handed me the document, and it was thick. Like, really thick. More pages than I cared to count. The whole thing was filled with legal jargon I didn't understand, but the gist was clear. If I talked about anything I saw or heard, they'd come after me. Hard. I should have backed out then. I mean, looking back now, that was probably my last real chance to walk away. But I didn't. I signed it, handed it back, and suddenly, I was in. Dr. Harrison didn't waste any time after that. He led me through a series of long hallways, each one colder and more sterile than the last. The air had that hospital-like chill, where you could almost hear the hum of the ventilation systems echoing off the walls. We passed other people in lab coats, some pushing carts of equipment I couldn't even begin to guess the purpose of, others standing in groups, quietly discussing things that sounded far too complicated for me to eavesdrop on. Finally, we reached another steel door. This one had a biometric scanner on it, like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. Dr. Harrison pressed his palm against it, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. What I saw inside wasn't quite what I expected. It was a large, circular room with a glass observation deck above us, lined with all kinds of monitors and equipment. But the centerpiece of the room was empty. Just this weirdly clean, metallic platform in the middle of the floor. It didn't look like a lab, or at least not a normal one. There was no obvious equipment, no test tubes, no computers, nothing, just that platform. "We've only had limited success with it so far," Harrison said, his voice calm, but with an edge of excitement. "But you're here for the next phase." I had no idea what he was talking about. I thought maybe they were going to have me brainstorm some crazy theory or something. But no, that wasn't it. A few more people entered the room. Engineers, I think. They moved like they knew exactly what they were doing. One of them nodded at Harrison, and that's when he turned to me with the strangest request I'd ever heard. "We want you to step onto the platform. Now, I'm not an idiot." I hesitated. This wasn't exactly the kind of situation you just jump into, right? But he kept pushing, explaining that they had tested it extensively and that I wasn't in any danger. They were just trying to get a different kind of reading, something about how different people interacted with the technology. My mind was racing with all the red flags, but the curiosity, that was winning, barely. So I stepped onto the platform. The second I did, the entire room shifted, not physically, more like the atmosphere. I could feel it. This low, vibrating hum started up, so low it was more of a feeling in my chest than a sound. The lights overhead dimmed slightly, and the platform under my feet began to vibrate, just enough to make me feel unsteady. Harrison and the engineers were all watching me closely. I could see their eyes darting between me and the monitors up in the observation deck. I didn't know what they were waiting for, but something was clearly happening. And then, I wasn't there anymore. I don't know how else to describe it. 1 second, I was standing in that room, on that weird platform, and the next second, everything around me changed. I wasn't in the lab anymore. I was somewhere else. The platform was still beneath my feet, but the room was gone. The walls, the observation deck, the monitors, all of it vanished. Instead, I was standing in what looked like a vast open field. But it wasn't a normal field. The sky above me was a deep, unnatural shade of blue, almost purple, and the grass at my feet was tall, too tall, like it hadn't been touched in decades. There was no wind, no sound. Everything was unnervingly still. For a moment, I thought maybe this was some sort of elaborate VR simulation, like they'd tricked me into testing some advanced virtual environment. But it didn't feel fake. It felt real. Too real. I took a step forward, and that's when I noticed something in the distance. At first, it was just a small, dark shape, barely visible against the horizon. But as I squinted, it started to move, slowly at first, then faster. My heart pounded in my chest as the shape got closer, and I realized it was some sort of figure, humanoid, but not quite right. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking. I froze. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get off that platform, to run. But I couldn't. My feet wouldn't move. It was like the air around me had turned thick, weighing me down, holding me in place as the figure kept getting closer. And then, just as it was about to reach me, everything snapped back to normal. I was standing in the lab again, my heart pounding in my ears, and the platform beneath me was still humming softly. Harrison was watching me, his eyes wide with curiosity, like I was some kind of lab rat that had just performed a new trick. What was that?" I stammered, stepping off the platform. My legs felt shaky, like they didn't quite belong to me anymore. "We've been able to establish contact with a dimension," Harrison said, his voice calm, almost too calm. but we haven't been able to send anyone through yet. Until now. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. They had sent me somewhere. I wasn't just hallucinating or inside a simulation. I had actually been there, wherever there was. The readings were off the charts, one of the engineers said, looking at the monitors. That's the longest anyone stayed connected. Connected to what? I asked, my voice rising. What the hell was that thing I saw? Harrison smiled faintly, as if he found my panic amusing. We don't know. Yet. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run as far from that lab as possible, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the thrill of discovery, or maybe it was the fact that I knew deep down that if I left now, I'd never be able to stop thinking about it. I had to know more. But part of me wishes I had walked away then, because what happened next was worse. After the first test, I didn't sleep for days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure. Its twisted, jerky movements burned into my brain like some kind of nightmare I couldn't shake. I kept telling myself it wasn't real, that it was just some side effect of the technology. Maybe a trick my mind played on me because of the stress. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, deep down, I knew what I saw wasn't just my imagination. I should have left then. I should have packed up, disappeared, blocked their emails, and never looked back. But I didn't. Something about the whole thing had hooked me, like an itch in my brain that I couldn't scratch. I needed answers. A week later, I got a call from Dr. Harrison. He wanted me back for another session. He tried to play it off like everything was fine, like the first test was a huge success. But I could hear something in his voice, a tension, like he was holding something back. Still, I agreed to go. I wasn't sure if it was curiosity or stupidity, but I agreed. The drive to the facility felt longer this time. The same black SUV picked me up, but now the excitement had worn off. All I felt was a pit in my stomach, like I was on my way to something I'd regret. When we got to the lab, the atmosphere had changed. The sterile, quiet efficiency was still there, but now there was this underlying current of nervous energy. The scientists and engineers I passed in the halls weren't making eye contact. They walked faster, heads down, like they were trying to avoid being noticed. Dr. Harrison met me at the door to the lab again, but he wasn't alone this time. There was another man with him, tall, thin, with this sharp, cold look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, just stood there, arms crossed, watching me like I was some sort of puzzle he was trying to solve. "This is Dr. Gray," Harrison said, gesturing to the man. "He's overseeing the next phase." "Next phase of what?" I asked, feeling the knot in my stomach tighten. Harrison didn't answer. He just led me inside the lab, and I could feel Dr. Gray's eyes burning into the back of my head as I walked. The platform was there, just like before, but this time the air in the room felt different, heavier, like the very atmosphere had shifted. I didn't need anyone to tell me that something had changed since my last visit. Before we proceed, Dr. Gray finally spoke, his voice cold and clinical. "You need to understand the risks. What you experienced before was just the beginning. The connection is getting stronger, and we're not entirely sure what that means. But there's no turning back now." I looked at Harrison, waiting for some reassurance, but he was avoiding my gaze. He didn't seem excited anymore. He looked worried. "What aren't you telling me?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "We've been monitoring the data from your last session," Gray said, stepping closer. "The dimensional space We connected you two. It's aware. It's not just a random environment. Something in there knows we're observing it. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. What do you mean, aware? He didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured to the platform. We need to go further. We need you to stay connected longer this time. We believe you may be able to communicate with it. I took a step back. Communicate? With what? Harrison finally spoke up, his voice shaky. We don't know. It's something we've never encountered before. But the readings indicate intelligence. We think it's trying to reach out. At that moment, I felt the weight of what I had gotten myself into. This wasn't just about aerospace tech or reverse engineering alien artifacts. They had found something alive, and now they wanted me to interact with it. I'm not going back in there, I said, shaking my head. You don't even know what you're dealing with. Gray's expression didn't change. You signed a contract. Those words hit me like a punch in the gut. The NDA. The thick stack of papers I had carelessly signed without thinking. They owned me now. Before I could argue, two of the lab assistants started moving toward me, guiding me to the platform. My heart was pounding, but I didn't resist. What choice did I have? I stepped back onto the platform, and just like before, the humming began. That low, chest-rattling vibration. The lights dimmed, and I felt the room around me start to blur. But this time, it was different. Instead of just vanishing into that strange field like before, I felt a sharp pull, like I was being yanked through space. The sensation was nauseating, like free-falling, without the relief of hitting the ground. When the pulling stopped, I was in the field again. The same dark, endless landscape. The grass swayed slightly this time, like a breeze had started up, though I couldn't feel it on my skin. But the figure, it wasn't in the distance anymore. It was closer, standing just a few feet away from me. I could see it now. Its long, thin limbs, its skin a sickly, pale gray. Its face, God, its face was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth skin, stretched tight over a skull-like shape. It was standing perfectly still, watching me, even though it had no eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen, locked in place as this thing stared at me, or whatever the hell it was doing. And then it moved. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying me. Slowly, it raised one of its long, bony hands and pointed at something behind me. I couldn't turn around, couldn't see what it was pointing at, but I could feel it. Something else was there, lurking just out of sight. The air around me began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. The figure lowered its hand and took a step closer, its movements still unnaturally jerky, like it was being controlled by invisible strings. Then I heard it, a voice, not out loud, but in my head, whispering, distant but clear. Help me. I felt my heart seize in my chest. The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, broken, like a radio signal cutting in and out. But the message was clear. It wanted help. The figure took another step closer, its blank face now just inches from mine. The voice grew louder, more insistent. Help me. Suddenly, I was yanked back. The field, the figure, the voice, all of it vanished, and I was back in the lab, gasping for air. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the floor, shaking. Dr. Gray and Harrison were hovering over me, but I could barely hear them. My mind was racing, still trying to process what I had just experienced. What did it say? Gray asked, his voice cold and clinical as ever. I looked up at him, my hands trembling. It wants help. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in Gray's eyes. Fear, real fear. "We need to shut it down," I said, trying to stand. "You have no idea what you're messing with." But Gray just shook his head. "Number, this is only the beginning." After that second test, something changed inside me. It was subtle at first, just a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. I felt like I was being watched, even in my own home, like there were eyes on me from places I couldn't see. The worst part, it wasn't just paranoia. I started hearing that voice again, the one from the field. "Help me." It would come in flashes, like a faint radio signal cutting through the static of my everyday life. I'd be washing dishes, and suddenly, there it was. Or I'd be in bed, drifting off, and then it would jolt me awake, the voice echoing in my head. I tried to ignore it, but the more I pushed it away, the louder it got. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I couldn't function. Whatever that thing was, it had latched onto me, and it wasn't letting go. After about a week of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Dr. Harrison, demanding answers, but he didn't pick up. I must have called a dozen times before I finally got a text back. It was short, cryptic, and absolutely no help. "Come back to the facility. We need to talk in person." That pit in my stomach returned, stronger this time. But what choice did I have? I had to know what was happening to me. I had to know what I had brought back with me from that place. When I arrived at the facility, something was off. It was the middle of the night, but the place was swarming with activity. People in lab coats rushed from one building to the next, talking in hushed, frantic voices. The usual calm efficiency was gone, replaced by a sense of panic that I could feel in the air. No one stopped me as I made my way to the lab. No one even looked at me. It was like they were all too wrapped up in whatever crisis they were dealing with to notice anything else. When I got to the lab, Harrison was there, pacing back and forth like he hadn't slept in days. He looked up as I walked in, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You shouldn't have come," he muttered, almost to himself. "You told me to come," I snapped. "What the hell is going on?" Harrison stopped pacing and finally looked at me. Really looked at me. His expression was a mix of guilt and fear. "Things are escalating," he said quietly. Before I could ask what he meant, Gray appeared from one of the side rooms, his face as unreadable as ever. He walked right past me without a word, his focus entirely on Harrison. "We're out of time," Gray said. "It's waking up." I had no idea what they were talking about, but my gut told me it was bad. Really bad. "What's waking up?" I demanded, my voice rising. Gray shot me a glance, his eyes cold and dismissive. "The entity, the thing you encountered in the dimension, it's not just a passive observer. It's sentient, and it's aware of us." Harrison nodded, rubbing his temples like he was trying to fight off a migraine. "The more we've interacted with it, the more active it's become. At first, it was just watching, but now it's trying to make contact." My stomach twisted. That voice in my head, the one that had been haunting me, it wasn't just a hallucination, it was real. "You knew this could happen?" I asked, stepping toward them. "You knew it was dangerous, and you still sent me in there?" Gray didn't flinch. "We didn't know the full extent of its capabilities. You were the first to make direct contact, the first to bring back something." He said it so casually, like this was all just a science experiment gone a little off course. But it was more than that. I could feel it in the air, that same heavy, oppressive feeling I had felt on the platform during the second test. It was here, in this building, in this very room. The entity wasn't just some abstract concept or distant figure. It had followed me back. "We're shutting the project down," Harrison said suddenly, his voice shaky. "It's gone too far." Gray's face darkened. "We can't shut it down." "Not yet." Harrison turned to him, disbelief in his eyes. "We have to. Don't you see? It's already infiltrated our world. The voice, the manifestations, it's only going to get worse." I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. "Manifestations?" Harrison swallowed hard. "People have been seeing things, not just you. Some of the other researchers, they've started reporting strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, distorted figures appearing in the periphery of their vision, strange sounds, like whispers, but no one's there." It hit me like a punch to the gut. This thing wasn't just stuck in that dimension, it was leaking into ours, and I had opened the door. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from that lab as possible, but before I could say anything, the lights flickered. Just once, then twice. The humming, the one I had felt on the platform, started up again, faint but unmistakable. Gray stiffened, his eyes darting to the monitors in the observation deck. "It's here," he said, his voice low. "We need to contain it." Before anyone could react, the room plunged into darkness. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor, rattling the walls. I could hear the faint sound of something moving in the darkness. Not footsteps, not machinery. Something else. Something alive. My breath hitched, and I backed up against the wall, trying to steady myself. But no matter how much I willed myself to stay calm, my heart was pounding out of my chest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, too tall and too thin, moving across the far side of the room. It was the same figure from the field, but now it was here, in the real world. Its movements were jerky, broken, like a marionette being dragged along by invisible strings. The air in the room grew cold, colder than I thought possible. My breath came out in foggy puffs, and I could feel the pressure building in my ears, like we were underwater. The figure moved closer, its blank, eyeless face turning toward me. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. My entire body was frozen, trapped in place by an invisible force. The voice, the one that had been haunting me for days, was suddenly louder, deafening, like it was right next to my ear. "Help me." It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a command. The figure was just inches away from me now, its cold, bony hand reaching out. I could feel the air around it, heavy and suffocating, like it was pulling the life out of the room. My vision started to blur, dark spots creeping in from the edges, and then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the figure was gone. The room was still. The hum had disappeared, but the air, it felt wrong, like the atmosphere had shifted, permanently tainted by the presence of something that didn't belong. Harrison was on the floor, gasping for air. Gray stood rigid, his eyes locked on the spot where the figure had been. No one said a word for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Gray turned to me, his face pale and drawn. "It's not going to stop." I didn't need to ask what he meant. I already knew. The door had been opened, and whatever was on the other side wasn't just watching anymore. It was coming through, and now there was nothing we could do to stop it. I don't remember how I got home after that night. The whole drive is a blur. I was running on pure adrenaline, my mind playing over what I had seen, what I had felt in that room. but no matter how hard I tried to shake it, that creeping sense of dread clung to me. It was like the air itself had turned heavier, and no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape it. For the next few days, I stayed locked in my apartment, barely eating, barely sleeping. I kept expecting the lights to flicker or the shadows to start moving again. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside my window sent my heart racing. I was waiting for it to come back. I knew it would come back. The voice, it hadn't gone away either. It was still there, lingering in the corners of my mind, faint but always present. Help me, over and over, like a broken record. Except now, it wasn't just when I was alone. I'd hear it in public places too, on the subway, in the grocery store. Always just loud enough to make me question if it was real or if I was losing my mind. Then one night, it got worse. It was about 2 a.m, and I was sitting on my couch, staring blankly at the TV. Some old movie was playing, but I wasn't really watching it. I hadn't slept in what felt like days, and I was too tired to care anymore. That's when I noticed it, the flicker. At first, I thought it was just the TV acting up, the screen glitching, but then I realized it wasn't just the screen. The room was flickering, the walls, the furniture, everything. For just a split second, I'd see something else. The field, that tall swaying grass, the dark purple sky, and the figure. Always the figure, standing just at the edge of my vision, watching me. Each flicker lasted longer than the last, until finally it stopped. I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was back there, in that field. This time, I could feel the ground beneath my feet. It was damp, soft, like I was standing on something that had been dead for a long time. The air was thick, too thick to breathe properly, and the sky overhead was churning, like a storm was brewing, but never quite arriving. The figure was closer now, much closer, no more than 10 feet away. Its head was tilted, like it was examining me, curious, but distant. It wasn't moving, just standing there, its long, bony limbs hanging unnaturally at its sides. For the first time, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Behind it, in the distance, there were more of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds, all the same, tall, thin, faceless, and they were all watching. The voice came again, louder this time. It echoed through the field, reverberating inside my skull. Help me. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many. A chorus of voices, overlapping and distorting, like a crowd all whispering at once. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't respond. I was rooted to the spot, frozen in place, as the figure took a slow, deliberate step toward me. Help me. I could feel it now, in my chest, pressing down on me. The air was suffocating, thick with the weight of whatever those things were. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body refused to listen. The figure was right in front of me now, close enough that I could see the way its skin stretched tight over its bones, pale and translucent, like it was barely holding itself together. Its head tilted again, and I swear, even though it had no eyes, I felt it looking into me, through me, and then it reached out. Its hand hovered inches from my face, long spindly fingers trembling slightly, as if it was hesitant. I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. I was trapped, paralyzed, as its fingers brushed against my skin. The second it touched me, my vision exploded. A blinding white-hot light filled my head, burning through every nerve in my body. It was like my mind had been cracked open, and for a moment, I could see everything. The figures, the dimension, the thing they were trying to communicate with. It wasn't just in that other world. It was here, bleeding into our reality. And it was spreading, growing. They weren't asking for help. They were using me, the connection, the voice. It wasn't a cry for aid. It was a lure, a way to breach our world. And now that the door was open, there was no stopping it. The light faded, and I was back in my apartment, gasping for air. My body was drenched in cold sweat, and I collapsed to the floor, shaking uncontrollably. I could still feel the figure's touch, like a brand burned into my skin. That's when I realized something was wrong. The flickering hadn't stopped. My apartment wasn't stable anymore. The walls, the floor, they kept shifting, warping between my world and theirs. I could see the grass poking through the carpet, the dark sky blending with my ceiling. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, tall, thin. It was inside now. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. There had to be a way out, some way to shut the door before it was too late. I thought about calling Dr. Harrison, but I knew it wouldn't matter. It had gone beyond him, beyond the lab. They couldn't stop it. No one could. The entity had found a way through, and now it was only a matter of time before the breach became permanent. I grabbed my phone and tried to dial, but the screen flickered, the numbers shifting and distorting. The voices started again, louder than before, filling every corner of the room, every corner of my mind. Help me. The walls began to warp, bending and twisting as the entity pushed further into my reality. Shadows crawled across the floor, stretching unnaturally, pulling toward me. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I bolted out of my apartment, down the stairs, and into the night. But no matter how far I ran, I could still feel it. The flicker, the pull, the breach was following me. I don't know how much time I have left. The connection's getting stronger, and soon it won't matter where I am. The entities, they're coming through, one by one, using me as the anchor. There's no shutting it down, no reversing what's been done. The door is open, and they're coming. That's the end. Whatever was lurking in that dimension isn't just a curiosity anymore. It's here, and I'm the one who brought it through. I don't know what's going to happen next, but I can feel them getting closer. If you're reading this, stay away from anything that feels off. If you hear the voice, if you see the flickers, it's already too late. You've been marked, and soon they'll come for you too.